Welcome to Le Weekend, your essential roundup of French news on culture, business, the economy, and current affairs. We bring you a convenient way to catch up on the stories from the past week in France, plus an additional focus feature blending reportage and cultural context. These are the news on Monday, March 23rd. Nestlé goes on trial over immeasurable plastic pollution of water bottle dumps. The food industry giant is on trial before a criminal court in Nancy for allegedly illegally dumping plastic bottles that contaminated the soil and water resources at exorbitant levels, as reported by Le Monde. Emmanuel Grégoire was elected mayor of Paris. The socialist candidate notably defeated Les Républicains candidate Rachida Dati in the second round, as reported by France 24. A French explorer has been declared dead 76 years after disappearing in the jungle. The young French explorer Raymond Moffret, who disappeared in January 1950 during a daring solo expedition in the Guyanese jungle, and whose body has never been found, has been officially declared dead by a judicial court, closing the book on one of the French overseas territories' most enduring mysteries, as reported by RFI. More on this in our focus story. These are the headlines on Tuesday, March 24th. French prosecutors searched the Paris branch of Edmond de Rothschild Bank in an Epstein-linked probe. The National Financial Prosecutor's Office said it had searched the Swiss private bank Edmond de Rothschild's Paris branch as part of an investigation into ex-diplomat Fabrice Hédin, who features in files on U.S. sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, as reported by Le Monde. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is traveling to France to sell the Iran war to skeptical G7 allies. The State Department said Rubio will attend a G7 foreign ministers meeting near Versailles outside of Paris on Friday, March 27th, to advance key U.S. interests and discuss shared security concerns and opportunities for cooperation, as reported by Le Monde. The French economy is holding up well against the conflict in the Middle East, but inflation is expected to climb to 2% in the spring, according to figures published by National Statistics Agency ANSEE, as reported by Le Figaro. The headlines on Wednesday, March 25th. France signed a charter with dating apps to fight homophobic ambushes. Top dating apps have signed a government charter to help tackle homophobic ambushes after one case was recorded every 4 days in 2024. The agreement sets out measures to improve reporting, data sharing, and user safety, as reported by RFI. France is seeing a sharp rise in cadmium exposure from everyday foods. Health authorities have warned that nearly half of adults exceed safe cadmium levels because of contamination in everyday foods such as bread, pasta, potatoes, and vegetables, calling for urgent action to cut the risks linked to the cancer-causing metal, as reported by RFI. France will host the new European Union Customs Authority in Lille. The northern French city was chosen by European Parliament representatives and EU member states to host a new customs authority as part of an EU custom rules overhaul to crack down on cheap parcel imports, as reported by Le Monde. The headlines on Thursday, March 26th. In a world's first, drilling has confirmed the significant presence of natural hydrogen in Moselle. Naturally dissolved hydrogen is present in the groundwater of the Lorraine Basin, according to researchers who discovered 3 years ago what they believe could be the largest reserve of natural hydrogen in the world, according to a statement by Française de l'Énergie, as reported by Le Figaro. The Minister of Education is sending a report to the justice system concerning TikTok. Education Minister Edouard Gueffret reported the social network to the justice system for incitement to suicide and illegal data transfer, denouncing the negative impact of the social network's algorithm on young people, as reported by Le Figaro. A grape seed found in the toilets of a medieval hospital revealed 6 centuries of Pinot Noir history. Researchers found that the 600-year-old grape seed is genetically identical to the grapes still being used to make Pinot Noir wine today, as reported by RFI. A French retailer will close its 80 stores in France and focus on e-commerce. The management of the Moselle-based chain Quatre Murs, historically specializing in wallpapers, announced on Wednesday the gradual closure of its approximately 80 stores in France by the beginning of June 2026, which will result in the elimination of 350 jobs, as reported by Les Echos. The headlines on Friday, March 27th. France's 2025 public deficit was less deep than expected. The deficit stood at 5.1% of GDP in 2025, beating the target of 5.4%, according to data released on Friday. The positive surprise boosts the credibility of the 5% target for 2026, despite the oil shock. Debt, however, continued to mount to reach 3.46 trillion euros at the end of 2025, as reported by Le Monde. The Philippines signed a military pact with France for joint operations. The new Status of Visiting Forces Agreement with France, signed on Thursday in Paris, came just hours after the Philippine military accused China of conducting dangerous maneuvers in the contested waterway, as reported by Le Monde. You are listening to Le Weekend. And now that you're all caught up from the news from the past week, it's time for our focus story. Today we look at why a young explorer made the news this week. There's a particular kind of story that refuses to end, not because it's unfinished exactly, but because the world never got around to reading the final chapter. This is one of those stories, and the fact that it took 76 years for a court to officially close it tells you everything about how deep the mystery ran and how long the people who loved one young Frenchman refused to let go. His name was Raymond Monfrez. He was born in October 1926 in Toulon, a port city in the south of France, the only child of Edgar and his wife. From the beginning, Raymond was restless. At the age of 9, he and 2 friends are said to have climbed the wall of the home they lived in the Var department, sending the police searching for 3 days. Although no biographical data confirms this incident. It was in defiance for its own sake. This was the first dispatch from a boy who simply could not sit still. By 1940, France was collapsing. Raymond's father was taken prisoner in Germany. Raymond was 14. Within 2 years, he had listened to BBC broadcasts and tried to flee for England. Mention of a failed attempt near the Spanish border is found in Le Monde archives. He returned to Toulon and threw himself into what he could do from where he stood. He played a role in the French resistance, distributing clandestine newspapers, writing resistance graffiti on walls, reporting troop movements, the quiet and dangerous type of work of a teenager who had decided the world required for him to do something. By the time the liberation came, he was 18. He had survived a war, and that for Raymond Moffrez appears to have been more than enough reason to go looking for the next frontier. In 1946, he left for Brazil, broke, young, barely 20 years old. In Rio de Janeiro, he made a bet with an editor that he'd go investigate unexplored territory deep inside the continent. Through a connection, he was signed onto a pacification mission to the Savante people of Mato Grosso, an indigenous group with a reputation for extreme hostility towards outsiders, at a moment when the Brazilian government was pushing its march to the west into their territory. The mission traveled roughly 1,800 kilometers into the interior. From Rio to the Mato Grosso frontier, found the remains of a previous expedition that had not made it and was ultimately forced to retreat after being attacked. Raymond survived. He wrote it all down. He returned to France in 1948, edited his notes, gave public lectures in Toulon, and announced his next project, the one that would define and consume the rest of his life. He was going to cross French Guiana on foot, alone, from the coast through the remote Tamak-Umak Mountains and descend to Brazil. No partner, no support team. His goal was to find isolated tribes in the deep interior, communities that had not been in contact with the outside world in 6 decades. He secured an advance from the French magazine Sciences et Voyages to write dispatches along the way. He arrived in Cayenne in June of 1949. He was 23 years old. He wrote about the leper colony at Akaruani, the gold seekers, the coastal Kalina people. In September, he joined a topographical expedition up the Mana River. He reached the town of Maripasola on October 25th, where rain pinned him down for 3 weeks, and then he set off into the jungle with his dog, carrying a backpack so heavy that he split his load in half and shuttled it through the forest a kilometer at a time, walking back for the second half before continuing. He kept a journal, every day a new entry. He wrote about losing the trail. He wrote about finding almost nothing to eat. He wrote about dysentery. He wrote about fighting a forest that seemed to push back at every step. The last entry in that journal is dated January 13th, 1950. In late February or early March, a man from the Emerillon people, now known as Teco, traveling along the river Tampoc, passed through a settlement called Claude and found Raymond's belongings in an abandoned shelter. It wasn't until June 1950 that a press agency reported the disappearance, and then the French press took hold of it. The Affaire Moffrez was born, fed by articles, hypotheses, and controversies that would run for decades. Raymond's notebooks, when they were found and eventually published as Aventures en Guyane, told a story that no one who read them forgot. They described a man methodically unraveling in the jungle, the hunger getting worse, the illness compounding, the body failing. And in one of the final entries, he described being so desperate for food that he was forced to eat his dog during starvation, the companion he had brought into the forest with him. His body was never found. What happened next is almost a story within a story. Edgar Maufrez, Raymond's father, refused to accept that his son was gone. In 1952, he left his wife behind in Toulon, boarded a ship, and began searching. He would search for 12 years across 7,000 to 8,000 kilometers through French Guiana, Brazil, and Suriname. He funded the search by publishing Raymond's diaries and his own account of the hunt, À la recherche de mon fils. A French television crew found him in Maripasola in 1961, 9 years in, still looking, and interviewed him. Finally, in 1964, near starvation forced Edgar to abandon his search. He came home without his son. Because Raymond had no descendants and because his parents could never bring themselves to declare him dead, the legal question of his existence simply sat unresolved, suspended for more than 7 decades. The question of his authorship rights unaddressed. His birth record in Toulon incomplete. His name on the civil register of Camopi, the small eastern Guyanese commune, home to the Wayampi and Teco indigenous community, close to where his journals were found near the Tampoc River, carrying no date of death. It was only in 2025 that someone finally moved to change that. Geoffroy Crunel, president of the Association of Friends of Edgar and Raymond Maufrez, made a trip to Camopi and discovered that no official record of Raymond's death existed anywhere. He learned that under Article 88 of the French Civil Code, any French citizen who disappeared in life-threatening circumstances and whose body was never recovered could be officially declared dead, and that anyone could initiate the proceedings. So he did. This month, March 2026, the Tribunal Judiciaire de Cayenne convened. The presiding judge was Naïma Saji. Before pronouncing her ruling, she said what the mathematics of time had made obvious. He would be 99 today. That leaves little room for doubt. Then she declared the death of Raymond Maufrez on 13th January 1950, the date of his last journal entry, the last moment anyone could confirm he was alive. The ruling is, as the court itself acknowledged, largely symbolic. Raymond's birth record in Toulon will now be updated. The civil register in Camopi will be amended. And one of French Guiana's most enduring mysteries, the young man who walked into the jungle and never came back, whose father spent a decade walking in after him, will have at least a legal end date. Raymond Maufrez has been the subject of dozens of books and at least 2 French films, the most recent being La Vie Pure, released in 2015. His journals remain in print. He died, as best anyone can determine, alone in the jungle at 23 years old. The jungle kept him, but 76 years later, France finally said goodbye. Thank you for listening to Le Weekend, your one-stop destination for the main headlines in France. Catch our weekly roundup every weekend wherever you get your podcasts. Stay informed.